Ireland's ambassador. His Excellency Richard Ryan, Ireland's ambassador to the United States and the former ambassador to the United States. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ireland, Jean Kennedy Smith, and Dr. Martin McAleese, the husband of today's guest of honor. Join me in welcoming all of them. As many of you may know, today's event is one of a series of events that has been co-sponsored by the Kennedy School of Government and the Irish Times. I had the opportunity to visit Ireland last year myself in the exchange that went the other direction, and we are particularly grateful that they are with us this year. And I want to offer a very special welcome to Owen McVeigh and Connor Brady, respectively the director and the editor of the Irish Times. Let me also, just in passing, thank our very good friend Sean Hogan, who has worked tirelessly to put this event together as he did last time, and we are very grateful for his assistance this year. Additionally, in the audience are members of the Kennedy School-owned executive program, the Leaders for Tomorrow, the program for Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and we are very pleased that they are with us today as well. Like Senator Simpson, I approached today's event with a certain sense of awe and of pride. Like many in this country, and in this city in particular, I am the child and grandchild of immigrants. My grandfather, who left Galway as a young man to settle in Butte, Montana, I'm sure is looking down on his granddaughter today and smiling with a great deal of pride as she's given the privilege of introducing today's guest. Today, President McAleese will be addressing the issue of the law and society, freedom of speech and the victim's freedom to talk back. As one of Ireland's foremost legal scholars, she is uniquely qualified to discuss this very important topic. The United States, Ireland, and indeed all of the world's democracies grapple daily with the question of how to balance a commitment to freedom of speech, no matter how offensive or how hateful it may be, against the need to protect the actual or potential victims of such speech from its pernicious effects. In America, it has been axiomatic that the most effective response to hateful speech and acts is more speech, as has been the case in this most recent horrific event in Wyoming. The Irish people as well, on both sides of the northern border, have long had to deal with the gnawing issue of freedom of speech. For decades, the troubles have assaulted free speech principles with firebrands on both sides, screaming invective and incitements to violence across the sectarian divide. Where and how, President McAleese might ask, do the rights of victims factor into the debate over the limits of free speech? We welcome the President at a time of great prosperity and dynamism and really hope for the Irish Republic. As she put it herself after her election last year, Ireland is now very much in its stride. It has its shoulders back. The Irish economy, so long beleaguered, is now the Celtic tiger, the envy of the European Union. Ireland was for 150 years a nation in which emigration far exceeded immigration, a process, to be sure, that led the thousands of Irish men and women to America's shores and forged the very powerful cultural and political tie between our countries. Now the dynamic has reversed itself, with the Emerald Isle a magnet for expatriates and for new immigrants alike. Ireland is taking great strides forward in gender equity and other areas of social justice. Irish high and popular culture have reached a new zenith of international acclaim. And most importantly, this last April's Good Friday Accords and the subsequent negotiations between the long-time combatants have finally offered a real hope that this terrible tragedy is finally drawing to a close. I know that the prospect of peace is especially gratifying for President McAleese as Ireland's first president to hail from the north. Born and raised in a Protestant neighborhood in Belfast, President McAleese earned a law degree with honors at Queen's University in Belfast and was subsequently appointed Reed Professor of Criminal Law, Criminology, and Penology at Trinity College in Dublin, succeeding another immigrant legal scholar, Mary Robinson, who would later precede Mary McAleese as Ireland's first woman president. Among her many professional accomplishments, President McAleese has been director of the Institute of Professional Legal Studies, which trains barristers and solicitors for the legal profession in Northern Ireland. In 1994, she became the second Catholic and the first woman to be appointed a Vice Chancellor of Queen's University, in acclaim for her work that she'd done there, an institution itself once associated with Protestant domination in the North. In the constitutionally symbolic office of Irish Head of State, the President is indeed a symbol. She is a symbol of healing, of recognition and reconciliation between the North and the South, and between Protestant and Catholic, of progressive social values combined with continued respect for tradition and the vital continuing role of women in Ireland. Please join me in welcoming President Mary McAleese. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Moderator and distinguished guests, it's a joy to be in your company on this very historic day for Ireland. Human rights are the oxygen of civilization. Nobody owns them. Nobody has authority to deny them to anyone else. Sir Edward Coke, speaking of the Magna Carta in 1628, in an era clearly before the introduction of gender-neutral language, proclaimed, "Human rights is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign. They are the birthright of all." And President John Fitzgerald Kennedy said in his inauguration address on the 20th of January 1961 that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. In this, the 50th anniversary year of the Declaration of Human Rights, we reflect on what humankind has achieved in opening doors, breaking down barriers, removing impediments in the way of the full flowering of the rights of the human person. We acknowledge the things which we have accomplished, and we recommit ourselves afresh to those which remain still outside our grasp. The Declaration is couched in eloquent and very persuasive language, the kind of language designed to comfort the oppressed, to challenge the oppressor. But when we move from its broad brush to translating its effects and ethos into everyday life as it is lived in the chaos of the world as we know it, we also have to acknowledge the perverse complexity of some of the issues we are called on to address. Freedom of speech is one such issue, and it's upon that freedom that I want to reflect in this address, raising probably more questions than I have answers, but offering, I hope, at least some insights. Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights proclaims that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Article 40 of the Irish Constitution of 1937 declares simply, "It is the right of the citizens to express freely their convictions and opinions." And of course, the famous First Amendment to the American Constitution states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. By freedom of speech, we generally mean, and I mean here, freedom of expression, not just words, but images and symbols, and even demonstrations or marches through which views and convictions are expressed, or indeed cultural heritage showcased. The positive value of free speech, as we have heard, is axiomatic, for in the absence of dissenting and even offensive opinions, it may simply not be possible to have the kind of informed and broad-ranging discourse which leads to a profound consideration of all the relevant issues and then ultimately to sound decision-making. And clearly, there are many instances, Northern Ireland being one of them, where civil rights have been won and other important social grievances have been redressed by people who asserted themselves verbally in ways which were at first very strongly resisted by their fellow citizens and even, of course, by the authorities. Such assertions have used words or drawn attention to issues which, as Justice William O. Douglas of the United States Supreme Court said in 1949, induce a condition of unrest, create dissatisfaction with things as they are, or even stir people to anger. The history of the debate concerning freedom of expression is, of course, full of ironies. Northern Irish Catholics, who were themselves beneficiaries of a civil rights movement which staunchly asserted its right to march, now find themselves challenging the demands of the Protestant Orange Order to march where it pleases. When Orange men proclaim their right to march the Queen's Highway, as they describe it, why then is there no simple convergence of interest, no clear, if grudging recognition that if all citizens are to be equally accorded fundamental freedom of speech, then we must be prepared to tolerate marches by people whose views we disagree with? Many Orange men march because of their tradition, their love of their tradition, and indeed there is much about their festive traditions which may be presented in a positive way. Orange culture is an important part of Ireland's history. I acknowledged this fact very publicly last July when, as President of Ireland and in the midst of mounting tensions at Portadown on the eve of the big Unionist holiday, July 12th, I hosted at my official residence in Dublin a reception for members of the Orange Order, especially for those south of the border. But a minority of Orange marches are deeply controversial. And in asking ourselves why this should be so, it's worth looking just for a moment beyond Northern Ireland to other societies in which the exercise of freedom of expression has also been a source of dispute. An American visitor spoke to me at the height of this year's trouble at Drumcree near Portadown in Northern Ireland. An Orange march had been banned and was refusing to disperse, and in the ensuing violence, which stretched right across Northern Ireland, 3 little children, 3 little brothers were burnt to death. And yet, during the standoff, my American visitor said that in the United States, the march would, in all likelihood, have gone through with the full backing of the law. As Professor Samuel Walker has written in his very fine book on the history of hate speech in the United States, this country protects even the most offensive forms of expression. And in his view, the First Amendment protection of freedom of speech is one of the glories of American society. Professor Walker and others, such as members of the Freedom Forum, are understandably proud of the way in which, during the 20th century, the United States Supreme Court has, in the most controversial circumstances, staunchly defended free speech, and indeed they argue convincingly that the best protection of the rights of minorities is the defense of the right of the individual to be heard. I have to say, I too greatly admire the robust manner in which the Supreme Court of the United States has defended and promoted free speech. However, you also in this country have faced situations of choosing between one person's freedom of speech and another's freedom to live quietly in peace. Situations where one person's voice, speaking freely, has consigned another to fear and terror, often, of course, quite deliberately. So far, the debate on freedom of speech has tended to produce winners and losers, and I am wondering, is there any way in which we can work to producing winners and winners? The truth is that sometimes the exercise of freedom of expression is actually experienced as personally oppressive and humiliating, especially, though not exclusively, by the weak, the powerless, and the deprived. An American case of 1992 is regarded as by some observers as a landmark in this whole debate, and some of you may indeed be familiar with the case. The Jones, a black family living in a white neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota, were subjected to racial harassment. One night, a burning cross, that symbol of racist persecution, was placed within the fenced yard of their home. Robert Victoria was among those who put the burning cross there, and he was, of course, later prosecuted under a city ordinance directed against the display of a symbol which one knows or has reason to know arouses anger, alarm, or resentment in others on the basis of race, colour, creed, religion, or gender. The United States Supreme Court upheld the First Amendment rights of Robert Victoria and struck down his conviction in a lower court. The judgment's a complex one, and indeed, Victoria was later sentenced to imprisonment for the same act, but under a different law. However, that was in fact very little consolation to Russ and Laura Jones, whose experience as victims in this case deserves close attention because it is by no means unique or unusual. The couple subsequently spoke to Laura Lederer, then of the University of Minnesota Law School, and I think it's worth hearing some details of what they had to say. Russ Jones told Laura that once the prosecution against Victoria was brought, everything turned into a circus. It seemed like the violation of our family was pushed to the back burner, and the entire case was focused on this skinhead's free speech right to burn a cross in our yard. We were hounded by the media, who twisted our words to fit their purpose. Being minorities and being also Jehovah's Witnesses, we are, of course, tremendous believers in the First Amendment. We couldn't believe it when we were characterized as against freedom of speech, as if burning a cross on our front lawn was free speech. For us, it wasn't an issue of freedom of speech. The Constitution should protect us from violence, terrorism, and prejudice. And Laura Jones added, and I think this is very important, no one seemed to care what the message of the cross burning was or what effect it had on us. To return now to Northern Ireland, its annual Orange Marching season provides some further examples of how one person's freedom of expression can be felt by another as a restriction of his or her own rights. Most Orangemen see their marches not just as an historic tradition, but as an expression and celebration of their hard-won rights and liberties. Many Orangemen, indeed and their families and friends, have themselves been victims of violence during the Troubles. Many see their own culture, their own political allegiances as under threat. But conversely, some of their parades are seen by Catholic or nationalist residents of the areas through which they march, and often indeed by the wider nationalist community as well, not just as a major intrusion on their right to live peacefully in their own homes, but as a deliberate assertion of superiority and an expression of a continued reluctance to accept the full equality of both communities. This is exacerbated by a too frequent refusal to engage in genuine dialogue, to find a compromise way of resolving difficult issues. Each side, therefore, can find it very difficult to understand the other's motives or to enter into the other's worldview. In the past, the Catholic community collectively tended to choose to stay silent in the face of unwelcome parades. Orangemen were happy not to look beneath this surface acquiescence. But in recent years, Catholic residents groups have exercised their freedom to talk back, to protest at the marches, and to insist that their sensitivities must be taken into account in the routing and the timing of marches. There have been, often due to an escalation of tensions far away from the locations themselves, confrontations, standoffs, and sometimes appalling violence and death. Inevitably, people other than those directly concerned become involved. A parades commission has been established to mediate and to promote dialogue, but where this is not possible, to adjudicate. It provides a forum for resolution of what is a running sore in the community, with a potential for continuing violence and instability. The Commission's membership includes people drawn from both traditions in Northern Ireland, so that decisions taken about banning or rerouting or permitting parades can incorporate community sensitivities and encourage mutual accommodation. The job of the Northern Ireland Parades Commission is as crucial as it is difficult. But of course, in a culture of conflict, not yet completely ended. We are trying to build the culture of consensus, but coming out of a long-standing culture of conflict, people tend to count their losses and gains, and unfortunately, compromise is too often seen as a loss. It is clear that the best way to resolve these issues is indeed through dialogue. Indeed, where there has been such dialogue, for example, in Derry, then satisfactory accommodations have actually been achieved. It does, of course, require both sides to move beyond the assertion of their competing rights. In a sense, this requirement, very easy to state but hard to achieve, is at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement itself. The agreement sends out a very clear message that the way forward is through affording each other respect and tolerance, through accepting diversity, ultimately, of course, through consensus and partnership. It's vital, therefore, that those of us who support freedom of expression do not resort to absolutist arguments as though we were proclaiming the divine right of kings and queens, as though an appeal to rock-hard principle could simply resolve the dilemma of conflicting rights both neatly and comprehensively. There are some very important questions here, questions about the voice, or more importantly, the voicelessness of the victim, which are sometimes dismissed or finessed from the agenda when free speech is discussed. The experiences of people on both sides in Northern Ireland can, I believe, provide very useful insights in answering those questions. Northern Ireland, for example, has a very creditable civil code which provides legal redress for verbal, sexual, religious, or racial harassment in the workplace. It effectively outlaws certain language and behaviour, notwithstanding the commitment to freedom of speech. In Northern Ireland, sectarian or sexist language has cost many employers dearly, and indeed you could say that it has created an entirely new industry for lawyers. Not an entirely unwelcome phenomenon. The voice of the victim has radically transformed the working landscape. Use of certain language today may be a disciplinary or a sackable offence. It is recognised in the workplace that freedom of speech does not mean freedom to victimise either a group of people generally or someone in particular. And more importantly, it recognises too that the intention of the speaker is much less important than how the words are received by the listener. Crucially, it is seen as essential to good industrial relations that the working environment be a place where people are not free to speak entirely as they please, but must conform to a code of conduct which maximises the protection of the dignity of each member of staff. The message clearly to staff is, think what you like, believe what you like, but keep it to yourself when you are at work. Out on the street, however, the same conduct which is unacceptable in the workplace, or indeed conduct which is infinitely worse, may be and often is protected by appeals to freedom of speech. Even in countries where constitutional provisions speak of the equality and the dignity of each human person, and indeed pledge to vindicate that equality by law, there is apparently freedom to express views which promote racial supremacy, gender inequality, or religious hatred. Arguing that opponents have an equal right to talk back, states which are founded on a commitment to human rights sometimes adopt a deliberately neutral pose on the public expression of views which are anathema to those very human rights, provided that the views expressed stop short of immediate incitement. However, being entitled to talk back and actually talking back are two quite different things. And in my view, it is worth reflecting on whether and to what extent we encourage and promote effective talkback. That is to say, the kind of talkback which ensures that free speech is not simply a license for the voluble bully. Take the immigrant issue, for example, an issue affecting so many countries today, including my own. Sometimes language used about immigrants is inconsiderate and wounding. I don't need to tell a Massachusetts audience that. 1 month ago, when I was in England, I visited an exhibition on Irish travelling people who lived there. In another era, these people were called Irish gypsies or itinerants, tinkers, in another era. Children at the exhibition, little travelling children, put on a play for me. And that play told of their experiences on the street and the names which they were called on a daily basis. The most repeatable of them is Dirty Jippos. What, I wonder, does it mean to those children to tell them that their tormentors are exercising their freedom of speech and that the state defends their right to do so? Was not this what was said to the inhabitants of Skokie, Illinois, in 1997, when a small Nazi organization asserted its right to parade through a largely Jewish community? The Nazis' case was, of course, controversially supported on First Amendment grounds by the American Civil Liberties Union, succeeded, of course, in the Circuit Court of Appeals, and the United States Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal. In the end, as it happens, the Nazi march did not go ahead in Skokie. But there remains to this day a real question about how far we can acknowledge responsive silence, silence provoked by fear and subtle, insidious intimidation, and sometimes not so subtle at that. How far should we acknowledge that the marchers, or the proposed marchers, were sending a very powerful message, throwing big shapes, intending to instill fear and paralysis? They weren't simply planning to march any old place. They were, after all, on a mission, out to destroy peace of mind in a Jewish community. Interestingly, in that case, it was the Community Relations Service of the United States Department of Justice which finally brokered a compromise in the Skokie case, exercising an embryonic function not unlike that of today's Parades Commission in Northern Ireland, balancing conflicting rights, trying to make sense of two parties, each of whom felt that right was exclusively on their side. Just as in Northern Ireland, both sides can invoke seemingly innocent and even noble values in ways which result in fine words not actually meaning what they seem to say. They may have, to borrow a phrase from a man who's sitting in the front row here, and I'll borrow it with some care, to borrow Seamus Heaney's phrase, and he uses this phrase about the words of enmity, they may have the toothed efficiency of a mowing machine. If you have experienced the wounding power of symbols and of language, you may not readily agree in adulthood with the sentiments of that reassuring refrain used by children, which used to say, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Name-calling, words, even tunes, even the sound of drums, can and do hurt. They can hurt deeply. They can offend and inflame. Language is sometimes a signal by the aggressive that exclusion and persecution will be tolerated. It can chill dissent. It can inflict psychological torment. Certainly, of course, many legislatures have codes which are designed to criminalize conduct which steps into that incitement threshold, incitement to hatred or incitement to violence. But these codes have, for the most part, been, I think, discarded as being somewhat ineffective and inadequate. Management of the public realm has to juggle the competing demands of all citizens for space for their views and for their cultural expressions. But I'm beginning to wonder if our juggling act isn't just a little bit trite and tired and in need of a new burst of energy, some updating. I don't for a moment dispute the thesis that to embrace freedom of speech means having to listen to things which we do not like and things with which we profoundly disagree. What I do say is that we need now to look at the ways in which we can enhance the right of free speech. How can we ensure that those who feel wounded by hateful expression have an effective means of being heard and of remedying any harm done to them by the barbs contained in those words? In many, many areas of life today, we are witnessing a growing acceptance of the need to listen to the voices of victims. In places where their voices were simply never heard, in places, in fact, from which their voice was excluded, victims' voices are now heard, and they are reshaping the landscape, in particular, the thinking landscape. Victims of crime, for example, are now backed by support organizations. In some countries, rape victims have secured independent legal representation because of their traumatic experience of trials. In Ireland, Victims of political violence have received some degree of recognition through the work of the Northern Ireland Victims Commission, set up by Secretary of State Dr. Mo Mowlam. And indeed, following the Commission's report in May of this year, Northern Ireland appointed a Minister for Victims. The Irish government has also set up a Victims Commission and appointed a Commissioner, the former Taoiseach, Deputy Prime Minister John Wilson. The focus of both bodies is clearly targeted, though, on the bereaved. It's a narrow cohort: the bereaved, the injured, their carers and relations. But these novel developments point up a growing consciousness that the voices of victims actually need dedicated spaces. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to validate the experiences of once voiceless victims. This opening up of listening space for stories of hurt is a relatively new phenomenon. It is as yet of very modest proportions, but it is undoubtedly in expansion mode. The historical paralysis often experienced by victims of bigotry is, of course, no accident. As Rita Kirk-Wilcock of the Southern Methodist University has put it in a very fine essay on hate as a stratagem for achieving political and social goals, she says, "The use of hate as a rhetorical stratagem allows the speaker to accomplish 4 specific goals: to inflame the emotions, to denigrate the designated outclass, to inflict permanent and irreparable harm to the opposition, and ultimately to conquer." The conquerors and the conquered do not always have access to equally effective public address systems. In fact, socially inferior groups may talk, but they aren't always heard. And these unheard groups do not have to be minorities. The experience, for example, of women has often been one of having important things to say, but often saying it to a brick wall in a society dominated by men. And indeed, recent research by Catherine McKinnon and others on the subject of pornography undermines the contention that if everyone is free to talk, then everyone is equal and can simply counter opinions which they find offensive. The relevance of social inequality to effective communications was very clearly recognised a long time ago by a North Kerry poet, Tá Grua O'Connor, who lived in the 17th century and who complained bitterly about his invisibility as a poor man. He wrote, "Though I see them, they don't see me. If they see me, they still don't see me. They hold with my fortune gone, though I'm there, it isn't me. The great world is agreed, having seen my goods grow scarce, though I utter the truth and the just, it is nothing but idiot noise." It is vital that we do not dismiss as idiot noise the protests of those wounded by verbal and visual manifestations of hatred. Our defence of freedom of expression can only be enhanced in the end by our concern for the victims of its abuse. Those of us who believe that words can hurt, those of us who know because we have felt it, are seeking a balance. We do not wish a treasured human right to be hedged in by so many qualifications that the right itself becomes more theoretical than actual. For this reason, I believe we have to seek ways of advancing the debate which will not reverse victories achieved in the course of a long international struggle for civil and human rights. Positive action rather than censorship, it seems to me, is the best way of fighting abuses of free speech, though some censorship or criminalisation of hatred cannot be ruled out. For if our constitutions and our treatises on human rights acknowledge the equality of each human person, then I wonder why should legal systems be seen to be neutral when children are called dirty jippos or when religious difference becomes religious hatred. Out of the tortured story of Northern Ireland has come a determination by the voiceless to be heard, not just to have their say, but to insist on a refinement, a finessing of the concept of freedom of speech. A tentative and as yet very patchy dialogue has forced people who were hermetically sealed from one another to start explaining their thinking to each other. Neither side has the comfort of living in ignorance of the other any longer, or worse still, in that awesome ignorance which assumes that it knows the other intimately and that the other is worthy only of disrespect and contempt. There is some evidence that in those areas where dialogue forums have been set up across the cultural divide, people are moving, albeit painfully, up a mutual learning curve and are beginning to deal with deep-rooted mistrusts and hatreds. There are those voices, of course, who would outlaw parades altogether. It's sometimes tempting to regard censorship as the perfect shortcut to a perfect society. And indeed, it is clear that the right of free speech is not absolute, even here in the United States. There are plenty of evidence of prescriptions on freedom of speech, whether it's obscenity, indecency, or inhibitions on fighting words or libel. Indeed, for its part, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights reminds us that the freedom of expression, which we know is a human right, is balanced by other obligations. And those obligations are duties to the community, in which alone the free and full development of the human personality is possible. It goes on to say that it gives due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others and the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in a democratic society. The question ultimately is not if it's wise to limit freedom of expression in certain circumstances, because clearly that is acceptable in certain circumstances. Rather, the question I'm posing is, are there means of enhancing freedom of expression so that potential victims of speech and imagery are protected and given a real effective remedy, even if that remedy is simply a credible and meaningful opportunity to talk back? There are at least 3 ways in which that right, that freedom of expression, can be enhanced, it seems to me, in which the vulnerable can have their problems raised and the awareness of their problems raised. First of all, education from the earliest years in both equality and free speech and in the avoidance of its abuse. In other words, education for building the kind of society, the script of which we have not yet written, but would like to write differently from our past. Support for research into the impact of words and images. And thirdly, the creation of accessible and dedicated public talkback forums or mediation mechanisms. I know that I grew up in Belfast, cheek by jowl with Orange culture. I learnt about it on the streets. I learnt little or nothing positive about it at school, and I presume that my Protestant British friends were taught nothing positive about Gaelic Irish culture in their separate school system either. In more recent years, schools have made some real efforts to promote cross-community understanding. The new political climate demands that those efforts be redoubled and extended way beyond the schools. They have to be supported now at community level so that, to use Brian Keenan's graphic expression, the evil cradling, which so often makes the home a crucible of sectarian hatred, is finally rooted out. The passing of the baton of sectarian and racist contempt from one generation to another has to be stopped if peace is to be more than the absence of violence. In other words, we coherently have to shift gear from a culture of conflict to a culture of consensus. Education has a very important role to play in helping people to discover new and imaginative ways of expressing cultural identity, ways more consonant with a culture of consensus, ways which can showcase a culture at its best. In a culture of conflict, tragically, there is too little joyful curiosity about each other's culture, and historical enmity has created a world in which a display of one identity is often seen, and indeed more often than not seen, as an attack on the other. A very important contribution needs to be made by the world of scholarly research. High quality, credible research into the psychological and social impact of hateful forms of expression is to be welcomed. There has been some work done in this area, some excellent work done, putting shape on victims' experience, allowing us to go into a realm from which we have so often been excluded unless we are among the privileged, to use that in inverted commas, who've actually suffered the experience ourselves. That research will help us to reshape our former thinking, to plot a way towards a healthier, freer, and more inclusive society. The need for public talkback venues is, it seems to me, the most important issue to raise here. By those I mean places of communication or protest for those who feel marginalised or oppressed by the exercise of free speech by others. So often each side feels that it alone is the victim, it alone is the martyr. We need to free these voices if we really are to enhance the concept of freedom of speech. We need to vindicate the rights of all to provoke dialogue and ultimately better inform public opinion. This feeling, this perception, which is so often real, of being put upon by others in the exercise of their free speech requires a very serious and profound response from all of those committed to freedom of speech. Naturally, we might all prefer stoical silence, tolerant silence. But now that we know what many of the abused feel and are thinking, we simply cannot any longer ignore our responsibility to them. It is by such creative and constructive initiatives that I choose to assert the rights of victims of freedom of expression. By recognising, too, I think, the relevance of social inequality to this debate, we lose nothing. Those of us who advocate for free speech can hope to find common ground with those who are principally concerned about the effects of such speech on the vulnerable and on the oppressed. While new restrictions on expressions and new punishments for hate speech or obscenity may and probably will be defensible and necessary, they are not always as effective in the long term as public education and, importantly, the social validation of the experience of the victim. One thing is certain, though, we need to show emphatically that the right to say something does not mean that the thing said is right. Freedom of expression is indeed a precious human right. We are called to defend it not only against those who would suppress free speech, but also against those who have made of that valuable freedom a license. They use it every day as a weapon to exploit, to hurt or oppress their fellow and sister citizens. They do it cynically and they do it deliberately. That is the price we pay for that freedom. It is a high price for those who feel the brunt of that weapon's poison and hatred. By all means, let us say to those hard of heart, you are indeed free to speak, but you will never, ever have the last word. Thank you very much for your attention.
Once again proving the power of speech. Let me now introduce, to lead our discussion and moderate the questions and answers, our co-host. Conor Brady has been the editor of the Irish Times since 1986. Educated at the University College Dublin, Mr. Brady has been with the Irish Times for 29 years in a variety of positions. He is the chairman, as well, of the Paris-based World Editors Forum, and additionally, for a number of years, chaired the board of counselors of the European Journalism Center. He is also known as having been a founder and a governor of the Irish Times Literary Awards. Conor?
Thank you, Dean Breck, and thank you also for the warm words of welcome. It's a great pleasure for the Irish Times to be back at Harvard. After an absence of 4 years. You happily came to see us in Dublin 2 years ago. It's a rather curious thing that we should have been here 4 years ago with Ireland's first woman president, Mary Robinson, and we're here again with her distinguished successor, Mrs. Mary McAleese. I put in mind of the innocent curiosity of a small boy in Dublin, where President McAleese was recently at dinner in a friend's house, where a 7-year-old boy was sent off to bed, and afterwards he came down to see the president, and his dad asked him, what did you think of President McAleese? And the little boy said, well, she's very nice. And the host said, and do you remember any other president? He said, yes. He said, I remember President Robinson. And the little boy went up the stairs, and halfway up the stairs he turned around and he said, Dad, could Ireland ever have had a man president? It's a great pleasure and a great privilege to be here for the moderating of the questions which follow on this, I think, very thought-provoking paper which the President has given us. Already sitting there, I became acutely aware of some very strong contrasts in perspective between what I, for example, as a European newspaper editor, would view as being some of the salient points of her argument. And I know that if some of my American counterparts were here, I think they would take quite a different view. And the sharp distinctions and the sharp changes in interpretation which divide us across the Atlantic on this, I think, will bear some scrutiny during the course of our discussion. We don't have very long. We have about 20 minutes, I guess. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the rules of the House. For those of you who are not, I'll just briefly rehearse them. We have 2 microphones. You must make your point from the microphone. You must come to one or other of the microphones. I want people to stand in line, or as I say, if you're European, you queue up. If you're American, you stand in line. Behind the microphones, I will take the questions in rotation, and I do want questions rather than lengthy speeches, and I will have to intervene very decisively if we end up getting party political speeches. So may I have the first questions, please? And could I also ask that questioners would identify themselves and their affiliation, if any?
I'm President McAleese. I'm Fred Schauer. I teach at the Kennedy School. I hold the, to some people, odd and to some people proud title of Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment. Many people think that someone with my title should not have agreed with you as much as I in fact did, but I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit more about the contrasts between the two countries, or be a little focus a little bit more on that contrast. That is, you've correctly identified an emerging international consensus from Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 19, the Irish Constitution, many other places, an emerging consensus of which Ireland is a part and the United States is an outlier. And if we accept your eloquent statement of that fact is correct, which it is, I'm wondering if you could focus on at least 2 possibilities for explaining the dramatic difference between the 2 countries. One, you talked a little bit about questions of harm, questions of offense, and the like, and possible cultural differences. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about why it is that you might think that what most people in the world are likely to describe as harms, Americans are likely to describe as mere offenses. And I'm wondering if, as well, you might say a little bit more about dialogue, because having talked eloquently about the importance of, let me put it tendentiously, restricted dialogue in some circumstances and then celebrated dialogue, I'm wondering if you could address the issue of the extent to which Americans often think we get dialogue by the absence of prohibition, and much of the rest of the world thinks we get better dialogue by channeling and constraining the nature of the discussion.
Thank you.
This will be interesting. I'm going to answer that insofar as I am capable of answering that. I'm going to answer it by saying something really about the nature of words and a presumption, I think, that lies at the heart of civilized discourse, that words do stop dead, that they don't have consequences beyond the hearing. And I couldn't say it any more. My words would never be as eloquent as our Nobel laureate, Seamus Heaney, who puts it so well in his poetry, how our lives become shaped by the silencing effect of words that are actually designed. They are designed to silence. Even the speaker may not even be aware, but they are so culturally loaded on both sides, both the receiver and the sayer. They are so culturally loaded that they keep shaping responses. I come from the Catholic nationalist tradition in Northern Ireland, which would regard itself as the silenced. And I think there are many, many examples. Many women would give you examples of the way in which words silence. And in that silencing, there is a recognizable psychological impact, not just in the person, but very often right across a tier or a layer of society. It could be all Catholics, it could be all nationalists, it could be all orange people, it could be all men, all women. And it's that we're trying to get at. It's to try and reduce the perhaps rather simplistic acceptance that words stop dead in their consequences, and rather to try and challenge that by saying that the more we listen to the voices of victims, the more we are humbled in our realization of how deep go the tentacles of words that hurt. Even words sometimes that the speaker will say with hand on heart, "I didn't mean to hurt." Nonetheless, as received by the person, as received by the human person, either at whom they were targeted or they mightn't have been targeted at all, that person feels the consequences and may very well have life-shaping results and history and epoch-shaping results as a consequence. So that's the simplest way I can put it. Does that make sense to anybody in the audience? Thank you.
Thank you, President. I should add that there are, in fact, additional microphones at higher levels as well, which I wasn't aware of, so you don't necessarily have to climb down from the height of Parnassus up there and come down to join the rest of the mortals on the face of the earth. Yes, sir, your question.
Owaira, do you believe that in the challenges that face us with the change in political climate, that we can easily erode the enshrined misconceptions of entitlement to culture? As only one of many trying exponents of the Irish language, excuse me, a language that has been perceived by the media and by others as being sectoral and one-sided, I can say, and there are many people in this room who understand this, that the Irish language is one of the oldest, richest languages of the Western world, but is also one of the newest languages of the Western world. It is a language which is inclusive and which is a language which can be used as a very important tool of reconciliation. As we say in Irish, "Ta an darna si sa wuli on." There is a second seat in the byre.
Goramaithe got Ursula Maccampbell Stoka and Anam. President, choose your language.
Well, Gia Gwich, agus gur míle maithagad don ceiste chorm. I'm trying to think, really, I suppose the best way I could answer that, and I wouldn't just put it in terms of a response to the Irish language, that's the immediate context of your question, is to say that in a culture of conflict, such as we have come from in Ireland, we tend to use a lot of things as weapons. We used our language as a weapon. Not everybody, but enough. We used religion as a weapon. We used God as a weapon. We tended to gather into our armory everything that was usable, and everything that was usable then became ours. I think it's one of the great regrets, and it has to be a subject of great regret, that in so many minds the Irish language is associated with, if you like, one section of the population. And again, as we start to unpack the voices that are saying to us that that is how they feel, I think until we listen to voices telling us that, we may never become aware of the narrow, if you like, the narrow straitjacket in which we put the language. I think it is true to say that a culture of conflict, unfortunately, has made hostages to fortune of things like the language, and it has happened two ways. It has happened both ways. There are those who have used the language in a contemptuous way, or who have treated it with contempt in order to promote the silencing effect, in order to launch barbs at the community against whom, the other community, as it were, whom they always see themselves in opposition to. I'd like to think that as we move coherently, I would like to see us, I have to say, engage in a very coherent shift of gear. And that means listening much more carefully to ideas and concepts we may have in and around the language. For example, when we talked about a Talkback forum, I would have thought a Talkback forum on the language would be a very useful thing to try and strip away all the ways in which we have, what have we done? We've really hardened the veins. We've really hardened up the veins. We've glued up the veins, and we really need to start chipping away at all that glue and all that sediment in order to let something freer, all that beauty you talked about in the language, really flow through both sides, so that ownership can be exercised by both sides. But in a culture of conflict, everything is used. Every darn thing in the armory is used. Language, God, you know how well God is used. I mean, it's the Yaboo school of theology. Also, my God's bigger than your God. My language is better than your language. That's how we've abused it.
One of the complexities of the relationship between politics and language in Ireland was borne in upon me recently. As many of you will know, this year we are celebrating the bicentenary of the Rising of 1798, in which almost 30,000 people lost their lives in a brief 3-month outburst of violence. But somebody said, at the Battle of Vinegar Hill, which was one of the decisive battles in the Rising, how would you be able to tell the Irish from the English? And the way you could tell the Irish from the English was that the English were speaking Irish, because there were nearly all militia troops from North Cork and Kerry. And the Irish, the rebels, were speaking English because they were largely descendants of Wexford people who were Normans and Elizabethans. So it would have been very difficult for a reporter on the day, I have to think. Question from the left here, please.
Thank you, President McAleese. My name is Neil Kennedy. I'm a student. And I just wanted to ask, in your address you talked a lot about the conflict between different groups of citizens. But if I could focus a little more on public figures, because I'm referring to politicians in particular. There's a case in France of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's a far-right leader who has been stripped of immunity as an MEP because of comments he made about the Holocaust. And I would say, given that by nature politicians have much more opportunity for public expression, should we not consider possibly a different category of laws and responsibilities for politicians as distinct from that of the citizen?
Yeah, interesting question, yes. Do you want to come back on that, or do you?
I think it's a very intriguing suggestion, if I may say so. I don't know that I want to be seen to sign up to it immediately, but much as I might like to. But no, I do think it's a very intriguing suggestion. I think there is always the question, isn't there, that those who are in positions of leadership, there is a question of expecting added value from them and added moral integrity in their leadership. Whether we get it or not is another matter. Mind you, on today, the day in which we celebrate the Nobel Prize awarded to 2 politicians, I am reminded how quickly we rush to criticism of them and how so often we fail to thank. And if we have a peace process, it is because the politicians gave it to us. So, but your idea certainly is an intriguing one. It's well worth putting into the mix.
Thank you. Your name, please?
My name is Eric Weinberger. I'm a resident of Cambridge and an occasional visitor to Ireland, both north and south. President McAleese, in talking about victims in the community and in the workplace and so on, the normal first recourse is to the authorities, namely the police. In your speech, you never mentioned the Northern Ireland Police Force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which of course is overwhelmingly Protestant and increasingly hated in both communities. It seems to me, although many in this room I'm sure will disagree, that you have a case of a conscientious and professional leadership who exert a very strong discipline over a rank and file who might not be so inclined. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the role of the police, the RUC, in the future of Northern Ireland in relation to victim intervention and victim relief, because it seems to be something rather at the forefront of the issue.
Well, in fact, I have to say that I disagree with the first part of your comments in relation to the appropriate authority. In relation to the kind of events that I've been talking about, the kind of hate speech I've been talking about, traditionally that has stayed, unless it falls into the realm, and I made this distinction, unless it falls into the realm of incitement to hatred or incitement to violence, by and large it doesn't fall into the criminal category at all. To go back to the workplace, I worked for 10 years in a university which had the responsibility in Northern Ireland, among other institutions, of working through the civil codes, but these were civil codes, they were not criminal codes. So they didn't actually involve, where they were broken, they gave rise to civil proceedings rather than criminal proceedings. So I'm talking about a realm of activity which is short of that which is traditionally within the bailiwick of the police. And it was that area that I was addressing, always accepting the fact, and indeed I said it, that the truth of the matter is that while most of us do have criminal codes against incitement and incitement to violence, you will find that by and large they are not used all that much. And indeed you will come across circumstances where you feel they most certainly should be used, and then you will be surprised when they are not, for a variety of reasons. You raised the question, a separate question, I think, about the police in Northern Ireland, and I think that there is no doubt that in a culture, as we move towards a culture of consensus, the issue of policing in a consensus-based society will be a very different issue from policing a conflict-driven society and a conflict-ridden society. That is precisely why, of course, the British government has set up a commission chaired by a very reputable and I think a very distinguished British politician, Chris Patten, who you may remember was the governor in Hong Kong. He chairs that, and he has a number of very able assistants, among them a man whom I spent a good deal of time in Canada thanking, Professor Shearing, who's helping him also, and who will be a very an acknowledged expert. So I think that these are areas that are very much on the agenda. They clearly formed part and parcel of the issues that you would expect the politicians to have agreed in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. I'm very grateful that that particular vexed question is not one that I am called on to resolve. But I am very grateful that there is a body who is charged with responsibility for taking us from the culture of conflict into a new era, and part and parcel of that new era will certainly be a new era for policing. And I think the police themselves will undoubtedly welcome that. It will be certainly much easier, we hope, to police in a place where everybody is signed up to and has respect for the police authority. I think that is the ideal. That is where we're hoping to get to.
Thank you.
I have a question from on high, and then I'll take the gentleman here on my left, please.
Madam President, my name is Kathleen Mahoney, or Manny, I suppose, in Ireland. I'm a professor of law from Canada, presently visiting as a fellow at the Human Rights Centre at Harvard Law School. I had the honor to argue in our courts, our Supreme Court, the two leading cases on freedom of speech, one on pornography and one on hate speech. And the result of those two cases were much similar to the analysis that you provided us with today, that the countervailing interests of equality and harm must be considered in any consideration of the free speech guarantee in our Constitution. The result of both of those cases was when harm can be shown, speech can be limited. That, of course, is dramatically different than the results of similar cases in this country, mainly due to, I think, and this is where I'm going with my question, the different view of constitutional equality in this country as opposed to in Canada. In Canada, our equality guarantees are clearly substantive as opposed to formal, as they are in the 14th Amendment. Given that Ireland will soon be facing big decisions with respect to a constitution, and given that the Strasbourg Convention does not guarantee substantive equality, I'm wondering whether or not, given your obvious interest in substantive equality, whether you will be playing a role in the arguments to come in Ireland with respect to what should the equality guarantees in your Constitution convey for the Irish people.
Thank you. I think with time pressing on us a little, what I might do with your agreement, President, is take the other two questions which we have here at the moment and maybe ask you to take answers from all those as we go.
Hope I remember them.
Okay.
As long as you remember them.
Okay. And could I ask the other questioners to be brief and direct in their questions?
Yes, Madam President. I just wanted to say welcome to Massachusetts. My name is Markham Lyons. My family left parish of Kilrinco back 150 years ago, but we still care about Ireland. And one of our chief concerns is, of course, the Mitchell Commission, which put together a peace organization in Northern Ireland. We hope peace will come. Do you think there's anything in the South can do to help augment the peace conditions which we all wish will come about?
Thank you. Parry.
Welcome also, Mr. President. My name is Pádraig O'Malley at the University of Massachusetts via Dublin. In some of the research that I have done in Northern Ireland, I found, or tended to find, that part of the problem was that both communities, the nationalist community and the unionist community, used the same language, the English language, in two very, very different ways. That the unionists are suspicious of the way the nationalists use the English language. In fact, I think it was Sidney Callaghan before the New Ireland Forum in 1984 who said, we don't trust you. But our tradition says our yeas are our yeas and our nays and our nays. You tend to exaggerate, you tend to play around with the language, you tend to use it as an end in itself rather than something towards an end, whereas they use it very directly. As a result, most of the documents that have emerged out of the peace process in the last, going back to before the Anglo-Irish Agreement, are framed in terms of frameworks, which is a Catholic concept. It's kind of ambiguous, it's out there, it's not defined, but to the Protestant mind, a framework is something anomalous, it's not fixed, it's something they can't target in on, it's something they can't assign a direct meaning to. So my question to you is, one, in your growing up and your experience in both the North and the South, have you experienced this or noted it in any way? And two, do you think as continuing dialogue takes place, that the fact that the two traditions use the same language but in very different ways, in different contexts of usage, that in itself may present many problems in trying to reach consensus on issues?
Thank you, Pádraig. Would you like to take those questions,
Yes,
President?
If I may, can I just deal with the very first question first, because just to say to you that since I'm not a politician, the role of the Irish presidency is to be above politics and not to be involved in political dialogue, or indeed to be involved in the kind of debate that you might expect on the subject that you raised. That debate will take place in a political forum, and my role in that, if indeed I have a role, if it eventually comes to legislation, would be to decide as President whether I have any doubt as to the constitutionality of any particular legislation that particular discussion might provoke. And if I did have any doubt, the worst case scenario would be that I would have a power, and do have a power under the Constitution, to refer it to the Supreme Court for the test of its constitutionality. So in a sense, that dialogue you're talking about will not directly involve me as President. And I'll also then deal with the other question to say that, of course, the South of Ireland is party to the Good Friday Agreement. It's an agreement that is designed to reshape the relationships between North and South, between the two islands and within Northern Ireland. And we are signed up signatories to the Good Friday Agreement. There is an unpacking process in that agreement. I described it yesterday as a causeway, but it's a causeway that we are just in the process of building. Every one of us have to drag the bricks and the stones and put them down in that place in which there never has been a pathway before. And everybody who has signed up to that agreement has decided, they have all said they're going to be the stonemasons. They're going to be the people who carry those stones that'll build the causeway. And the Irish government and the Irish people gave, I think, the most resounding indication imaginable when, over in the referendum that was held in May, they said in huge numbers, we are signed up to this. This belongs to us. We have ownership of this. And yes, there are many things that we can do and many things that we will do to facilitate the process. I, for my part, as President, said when I was elected and in my inaugural speech last November 11th, said that I can't have policies as a President, but I can have a theme. And the theme is building bridges. And among the building of bridges, among the things that I regard as important, and there are many, many bridges to be built across many different areas and fractures and fissures in Irish life, but one of the biggest is the north-south. And one of the biggest is between the so-called two communities. I have a particular sensitivity to it, I think, coming from the north, having lived both north and south, and I hope some degree of distilled wisdom and insight that will help me to drive forward that agenda and to do it with a generosity of spirit that I hope will be recognized by the other who might regard themselves as estranged from me. I hope to be able to bridge those estrangements and to do that in a very positive way so that over the 7 years of my presidency, we will look back and say that along with all the other efforts that are being made, and there will be thousands of them, to show friendship, to befriend across the divide, to go the extra mile, to build the culture of consensus. I hope that at the end of the 7 years, we will look back and say, yes, we did build it. It's there and the evidence is tangible. One of the problems, though, is the very one that you address, Pádraig, the way in which and you're just absolutely right, there's just no other way to say it, you're just so perceptive. And I have written about this myself and I've experienced this myself. I think everybody in this audience, and there are a number of people in this audience who have been deeply involved in the process. We're very fortunate to have with us in this audience a number of the architects of the agreement, our Minister for State, Liz O'Donnell, the face of a new, dynamic, radical young Ireland, Sean O'Higgins, our ambassador here in America, but also, of course, a pivotal figure in building up the goodwill for the agreement, a man who's really his talents have been placed at the heart of the agreement. They will tell you that your point is very well made, that the use of the English language, the way in which we use language is very, very different. I remember John Dunlop, the former moderator of the Presbyterian Church, explaining to us that within the Presbyterian or Protestant mindset in Northern Ireland, the word has to have a definitive meaning. So they would go into a negotiation with a bottom line, not an opening bid position, just a bottom line, because the word had to mean X. On the Catholic side, not to use the word Jesuitry in a pejorative way, but to say that there was, you're quite right, that there is there's a soft centre to language and an ease around the edges of words that we would use to try and create space for consensus and for compromise. So you would have the other side going in with an opening bid position. And the first thing they meet is the bottom line from the other side, which invariably leads to breakdown. And both sides having a view, but you always come in, you've no compromise in your heart at all, you have no intention of compromising, which in a sense is true, but it's not maliciously meant. And on the other side, the Protestants saying, you always come in with weaselly words. We don't know what your words mean, they're like mercury, we can't nail them down, they keep going all over the place. So that you had always these dialogues going this way. All using the English language, but going this way. I actually think, in all honesty, because we've had a debate about those things, thanks actually to the kind of scholarship that you're talking about, because for many, many generations, we kept talking that way and just presuming the other side was daft or downright silly or downright mean-spirited. Now we actually know it is cultural mindset. We educate ourselves to be this way. We are taught to be this way. There is a cradling involved here. And we have to know each other and we have to know ourselves so that when we sit down next and we hear the bottom line, we're able to say, not, oh God, there they go again, doing the same old thing, break down before we even start, but rather to say, well, hang on a moment. We understand this process. We understand where this is coming from. And I think that one of the strengths of the Good Friday Agreement, if you'll forgive me for saying so, is precisely because factored into it is an intuitive understanding of that very thing which we did not intuitively know before. It was staring us in the face, but we never recognized it. And then when we recognized it, we weren't sure, could we do something about it? And I think the Good Friday Agreement is a manifestly wonderful example of being able to manage the process by using those very psychological insights that you describe. Not to say we have it cracked forever and ever, but rather having been able to construct this extraordinary against all the odds agreement, having finessed all those problems that you describe, we have now shown that we can do it. And I think the learning curve has been a very valuable one, a very rewarding one. And I think out of that, we now have sufficient repository of skill which allows us to critique ourselves and to critique the other and to prepare the way for the kind of engagement that will allow us to make sense of exactly the scenario that you paint so well.
I'm under very heavy pressure for time, but there is one gentleman present who's been standing here patiently. If your question is brief, I will allow it, and perhaps, President, you would respond, because the time pressures are bearing upon us.
Understood. Thank you. First of all, Madam President, it's an honor to be before you, given my perception of Ireland. It's a country of conviction and struggle and of great pride, so it is truly an honor. Given that most countries, and particularly Ireland, takes its cues from this country, this great country of America, in light of the fact that today still we have great chasms between African Americans and whites at the social level, at the political level, and certainly at the economic level, but more so importantly at the educational level, as you mentioned in your talk this afternoon. What advice can you provide or give America in helping to close that gap of these two dichotomies, one black and one white? I'd be very curious to know your response.
Wow.
I mean, if you look at the audience, for example, it's pretty homogenous here.
Simple question.
Well, very simple. I think you're right, though. I think that there is a read across from so many conflict situations. And I think coming out of the Irish, the Good Friday Agreement, I've been really very taken by the number of people who have said that the read across from what we have accomplished in Ireland and are in the process of accomplishing more, the read across from that to other situations is very, very obvious and very evident. Yesterday, for example, I was at a meeting with members of the Irish Immigration Bureau who are dealing with young immigrants, and we still have a small number, a trickle of immigrants still coming from Ireland to America, ill-prepared, and who fall happily into the lap of the Irish Immigration Bureau who helped them. And they were making the point that they are now making common cause. Instead of just arguing the Irish case, for example, with the American government in relation to visa waivers and in relation to visa and immigration laws, that they are going to find common cause with other immigrant groups from whom in the past they didn't really think they had much to learn, but now they are learning. In fact, they have a lot to learn. Yes. And a lot to offer each other. So there's there's an old Irish expression which says, Ní neart go cur le chéile, which is that we are strongest when we work together. And it ill behoves the Irish who have drained, it seems to me, the American administration over recent months and years to advise, particularly as we go into the peace process in this early stage. But certainly if there is a read across, and I think there probably is, part of the read across really has to be about creating respect. I think respect is everything. That when people feel respected, you can accomplish so much. By and large, if you have conflict, if you have people who are unhappy, you have people who do not feel respected. And I think where you have that conflict, you stop and you ask, what are the inhibitors in the way of allowing these people to feel the respect that is their God-given right, to quote President Kennedy?
Thank you.
We have to leave it at that, I'm afraid. Quite clearly we could go on for a long time because we really have only scratched the surface of a huge range of interconnecting topics of universal interest and significance. President, thank you for a most stimulating address, for taking your questions straight on and for responding so frankly and so fully. Dean Burke, thank you once again for your hospitality and for receiving us. Thank you all for being with us. See you in 2 years' time. Well done, Mark.